Okay, good evening, everybody. Hello. All right, good evening, all. Welcome to 13th and final Rock Talk of this 2026 season. Pretty amazing. My name's David Buck. I'm the Associate Director here at the lab. Our Executive Director, Sarah Morris, is taking the night off from Rock Talk introductions. She's in the room, but taking the night off from doing this, so I'm stepping in for her. So thanks for joining us, you all. This is a really great opportunity for all of our community to get together, both folks online and, of course, all of our classes that are here with us on island, to listen to a talk about sort of an emerging topic in the field of marine science, broadly speaking. The lab has been conducting these types of seminars for many years. In the early days of the lab, these talks would often be held outside, actually in the intertidal or on the rocks. Hence the name, Rock Talk series, a Rock Talk seminar. So for those of you that aren't aware, Shoals Marine Lab, we've been in operation since our 61st season. For those of you that just recently arrived yesterday, this is the 61st season the lab has been in operation. The lab is jointly run by the University of New Hampshire and Cornell University. So we're really excited for all of y'all to be here. We have hopefully folks joining us online tonight, but the folks in the room, we've got 4 classes with us, which is really exciting. That we're in the second week of our marine environmental science course. That was intense. And then yesterday we welcomed 3 new classes. We have our marine vertebrates of the Gulf of Maine course. Excellent. We have our Introduction to Scientific Illustration class. Little extra noise for that crowd. And then our Marine Immersion course. Where are you all? Right on. So welcome. So the format for this seminar, let me get y'all's attention real quick. The format for the seminar will be kind of a standard scientific talk. Our speaker tonight will speak for about 45 minutes. And then there'll be opportunity I'll walk around the room with this microphone, folks in the audience, and we'll also pay attention to folks online, can ask questions. We'll have about 15 minutes of a Q&A. So without further ado, it's a wonderful honor to introduce tonight's Rock Talk speaker, Dr. Jim Coyer. Jim has been a member of the Shoals for 4 years. When he graduated from University of Southern California in 1982. He actually came straight to Shoals Marine Lab that summer and started teaching our undergraduate course, that is our underwater research class. And he taught that class up until 2018. He has mentored dozens and dozens of undergraduate students, lots of graduate researchers, all many of them focused on ecology, the subtidal ecology here around the Isles of Shoals and specifically around Appledore Island. While he was teaching courses here at Shoals Marine Lab and mentoring students, he also had a really fabulous career, a very busy career as both a faculty, as a teaching faculty and a researcher. He held positions at Marymount College, SUNY-Stony Brook, Hopkins Marine Station, and then later took a position that lasted almost 15 years at the University of Groningen. I hope I pronounced that correctly, in the Netherlands. During the course of that research and faculty career, Jim published over 80 peer-reviewed papers, primarily heavily focused on algae, marine algae specifically. And throughout his sort of research career, Jim always found time to come back to Shoals Marine Lab, as I mentioned previously. He's mentored hundreds of students, lots of graduate students. And although I'm say this, he hasn't done so yet, gorge himself on chocolate chip cookies. So chefs, maybe if y'all could make some cookies for him tomorrow, that would be great. Since leaving the lab in 2018, Jim has been working for the National Geographic and their Lindblad Expeditions as a naturalist. That work has carried him not all over the world, but to many far-flung places, everywhere from Antarctica to the fjords of Norway, to Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, and many places in between. But throughout his wanderings, we're very fortunate, he always finds a way to. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jim Coyer. His conversation with us tonight is going to be on salmon farming. The title of the talk is Salmon Farming / Ranching in the North Atlantic, a discussion. So please give a warm welcome to Jim Coyer.
Thank you, Dave. Salmon farming is a highly contentious issue. For example, as I speak in the Falkland Islands, the temperature of the debate between those for and against open pen farms that are just starting up approaches boiling level. And the temperature in the debates in other parts of the world, Tasmania, Argentina, Chile, Scotland, is at the simmering level. So what I hope to do tonight is to provide you with information on both sides of that debate and allow you to make your own decision with respect to, should I buy wild salmon only? Should I buy farm salmon only? Both, or ignore all of them. So I think the first thing we need to look at is this particular graph. We have here time. And the key point is about 1985. Because at this point, the capture marine volume stays the same. And at about that same time, the aquaculture marine starts to increase. Now, this flat line for capture marine is really important because in the 40 years since that started, we have had major changes in ship design. The ships are bigger, they're faster, they have tenders, so they can offload the catch and go right back to fishing again. There are improvements in the net design so that they can catch more fish better and more efficiently, not have as much weight. There have, of course, been improvements in location, both on the surface and then all kinds of electronics that will tell them where the fish are underwater, not only where they are, but what species they are, so they can eliminate bycatch as much as possible. And of course, we also have now the drone technology, so they can send drones out over the vast ocean to look for those schools of fish that they might otherwise miss. And they even have these automated vehicles that zip all over the ocean and send back information about where the fish are. So despite all of those improvements, it's a flat line. We have not only fished down major population, but we've decreased the size as well. So if we continue to have a demand for fish, which I think we will, we're not going to get it from the wild. We're going to have to get it from farm fish. And all we can do is to ensure that the methods we use for farming fish are as sustainable as they can be, and of course, continue to try to improve that and make them even more sustainable. So if looking first of all at marine capture major fishes, starting out with anchovies, horse, pollock, tuna, herring, all those standard ones. Salmon isn't anywhere on there. They don't catch commercial salmon. If you look at the aquaculture species, the first four are fresh fish. Salmon or salmonids, which include salmon, of course, and trouts, are down there about mid-list. Look at this particular graph. Global supply of salmonids now, salmon and trout. Wild, decreasing. Farmed, increasing. 80% is now farmed, not wild. So farm fish is here to stay. We just need to make sure that it's as sustainable as we can. So the fish that is important in the famine, going now to salmon, is the Atlantic salmon. Historically, as the name implies, it ranged all through the North Atlantic. And it was a very numerous fish. So as a result, it was overfished, as you can see here. It's declined considerably, and it is no longer allowed to be collected commercially. There are some recreational fisheries allowed. Not in the US, it's illegal to fish, even recreationally, for Atlantic salmon. Canada has a season, but only for fly fishing, and it's a catch and release. And Norway and Iceland have seasons, but they are limited in certain rivers and certain times of the year and certain years. And are mostly run by clubs. They have a really high license fee and a really high use fee, so it's not really a viable thing. So all the Atlantic salmon that we get now is farmed. So what does a salmon do? Well, first of all, they swim upstream to a river. And the female goes down, makes a little depression in the nest, in the ground called the red. And so she is in there depositing the eggs. The male will come up alongside, deposit the milk to the sperm, and then the female will bury the eggs, and then she'll run off and do it again until both of them are spent. And in the Pacific salmon, they die right after this. In the Atlantic salmon, however, they can stay alive for another year. About 10% of the population can spawn again. Not so for the marine species, or the Pacific species. So the Atlantic salmon, eggs, about 1 year, they turn into fry, and then go into a par stage for about 2 to 4 years. And then they just change into the smolt, the process called smoltification. And this is when they go from freshwater to seawater. And they need this time, 6 to 12 months. And the Atlantic salmon and the Pacific salmon, this can be immediate, or for other species, the Pacific salmon, it can be as long as 3 years or so. But during this time, they make that physiological adaptation from freshwater to salt. In the case of the Atlantic salmon, they then go to sea for 1 to 3 years, and they come back, and the whole cycle starts again. So why the Atlantic salmon? Well, it grows nicely, quickly, twice as fast now as when they first started to harvest this. So they've improved the feed, they've improved the stock, they've improved a lot of things to make this a feeding fish rather than a out in the wild fishing type fish type. Tastes pretty good. We can talk about that later. So where the main suppliers are, this is an interesting graph. The orange shows the predominance of farming. The pink shows the predominance of fishing. The U.S., of course, has far more salmon by fishing than it does by farming. Fishing, of course, exclusively comes from the Pacific Ocean, Alaska. And that's the source of 97% of the fresh wild caught fish in the U.S. In Europe, of course, it's the opposite situation. All farmed fish. Russia, all farmed fish. Japan, all farmed fish, although Japan is increasing its numbers of farmed fish. I'm sorry, Japan is all wild caught. Australia is farmed fish, highly contentious there in Tasmania. New Zealand is interesting because it does not farm the Atlantic salmon, but instead it farms the North Pacific Chinook or king salmon. It takes much more time, effort, more expensive, but they're going for quality, not quantity. Then they get top dollar for that. And then in Chile, I'll talk more about Chilean farming in a bit. Okay, sources of farm salmon to the U.S. Over half of this farm salmon you see in the markets or you see in supermarket sushi stands comes from Chile. Norway produces about a quarter. Canada about 11%, primarily from the maritime farms. There's very little fish farming in the Pacific British Columbia region. A little bit from the Faroes. Americans consume 67% of our farm fish and 33% wild caught fish. And the safest sources for farm fish are Norway, Iceland, and the Faroes. And I'll explain that a little bit later as well. Yes, they taste differently. The one that's highlighted is the Chilean one. Fat content is about 7%, half of that of the other ones. That is what people want in good tasting salmon. You're not going to get that in Chilean salmon. It's mild, it's lean, water temperature is much about in the mid-range. And this is the key thing, it's affordable. As opposed to the Faroes, ultra premium, Scotland, super premium, Norway, premium. So if you want to get farm salmon, you need to know your source. Natural colors of wild salmon. Salmon, the color of salmon is what they eat. Sockeye, for example, eats primarily krill, and they get from krill something called astaxanthin, and that gives them that bright red color that you see here. The other species depend to various extents on the krill. They will eat other things, fish and so on. The degree of pinkness that you see is going to be somewhat less. But you can still recognize this as a salmon as opposed to a tuna or anything else like that. Now, why are farm salmon pink? They don't get the access to krill. That's because there is a pigment called astaxanthin, which is synthetically produced, and the synthetic form is exactly the same as the wild form. And in over 50 years of use, there's been no cases of cancer or anything else resulting from use of this compound. However, despite that, Australia and New Zealand banned the production of that, the addition of astaxanthin in the fish food. So the fish that you get in Australia and New Zealand are pinkish, not pinkish, they're more white. That chemical is up to 25% of the feed cost. And they have a salmon farm lineal, so that below this level of pinkness, it can be very, very difficult to sell. You have to have your salmon that you're farming at least this level or above before it's going to be palatable or presentable to general public. Okay, 3 types of salmon aquaculture. I'll go through each of those. First of all, starting with open pen. As the name implies, the fry and the smoke are raised in freshwater tanks on land. And when they get to a certain size, they release the post-smolt stage, about 1 kilogram in size, about 2.5 pounds, into these vast circular tanks. Depending upon the size, they can hold anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 individuals. Norway has a rule that in each one of these tanks, there has to be 92.5% water and 7.2% fish to prevent overcrowding. That's not followed in other places as well. So the potential for overcrowding is very real in these problems. Another one is salmon ranching. And this is from hatchery. You raise eggs, fertilize the eggs and raise the fry and the smolt in fresh water. And then you release the smolt immediately to the sea. 3 to 4 months old, 1.5 inches in size, 100,000 to 500,000 per individual batch. And you get a return rate of about 0.5 to 3%. That doesn't sound like much of a return, but when you're dealing with these vast numbers of release, that's pretty good. Then when these fish come back to the natal stream, which is either where they were hatched, or sometimes they take the smoke to another place and raise them there, and they'll come back to that other place. When they come back, then they are harvested. They're harvested to the extent that 70% will go for the general public, and about 30% will be reserved for the fishermen that will come back to that natal stream to fish. So it's pretty much a self-sustaining thing. You see this in Alaska, Japan, Russia, and Iceland. In Alaska, there's 26 private fish hatcheries, which get their money from taxes and reimbursement, NGOs, and that sort of thing. 2 state and 1 tribal. Alaska does not have open pen. They never have, and they never will. So Alaska has all the salmon that are farmed coming from the hatchery. And then there's fjord grazing. This is an experimental system, which is really interesting. First of all, it's an open pen, or it's a closed pen. And they put it in very deep water. So the salmon are really deep. Now, the thing about lice, I'll talk about lice in a minute. Lice, so if you can keep a salmon in cold water, there's no problem with lice. But you got to feed them. So what they do in Iceland, this is mandatory. All pens have to have a light, an LED light. That light will not only affect their cycle, stop them from reproducing, they're simply eating instead of about reproduction, but it also will attract zooplankton. So what the salmon are eating is not prepared pellets, but they're eating zooplankton coming to the cage that have been attracted by the light. And that's a really interesting way of doing it, and it gets around some of the major problems that are in fact where they are farming. 5 problems with the sea lice, escapees, waste food accumulation on the bottom of the pen, antibiotics, and food composition. But let's look at each of them. First of all, lice are ectoparasitic copepods. This is not a good fish. All fish in the ocean, 1 to 2, maybe 5 of these individuals on their body somewhere. If that's an easily tolerable number of parasites. When you get up to this kind of a number, not only are the parasites in general attracted to the head where the skin is lower, thinner, but these kinds of numbers are going to burrow into the tissue, start digging through, and in the process, going to really affect the osmoregulatory properties of the salmon. They're going to put the salmon into stress. In addition, it's going to cause secondary infections and so on and so forth. But you do not want this sort of a thing. And this is what happens a lot of times in the open pen system. So how do you get rid of this or do you reduce it? First of all, this is the sea lice, just settled, maturing, the mature sea lice. You can see on the underside, it sticks to the salmon like 2 little suckers, and it will feed on the mucus And if it gets to the mucus, it can start feeding on the tissue. Again, 1 or 2 individuals per fish, not a problem. 20, 30, 100, big problem. Crowding induces more, so you can see a heavily infested individual. Not clear if lice caused this wound or if this wound is caused by something else. But nevertheless, you get a lot of salmon or lice that's going to create some problems. And this is what you want to see, this kind of thing. So how do you get rid of it? Well, machines and chemicals. Chemical, a lot of problems, right? They have treatments, mechanical treatments. Unfortunately, the salmon are going to be evolving resistant to whatever chemicals you put in, and you will have heavily polluting chemicals that you would introduce into the ocean. Mechanical freshwater rinses. Lice do not like fresh water. You put them in fresh water, they drop off. But you got to do this individually for 200,000 fish, in each one of 8 to 10 pens. Not a very time efficient solution. So these have been used. They're not employed very much now. Cleaner fish, put in cleaner fish to pick off the ectoparasite. Yeah, this works. There has been some research done on this over at UNH, for example. But you need a lot of cleaner fish, and they tend to shut down in cold water. And in some cases, they go for the eyes, which is not what you want to have. So this is met with mixed success. Nevertheless, it has been tried and it continues to be used in some cases. Then you have pens. Remember, lice do not appear in cold, deeper water. So this is one pen design where you have a lice-proof skirt in the upper shallow waters, which allows the salmon to stay deep, and they don't get in contact with the lice because the lice are kept them so they can go up and down, up and down. You can also have a chimney net. We have a barrier here, no lice down here. Lice can't get up here because of that net, so the fish can come up and down like this chimney and not be encountering any lice in the process. Of course, the more nets you put in the water, the more you have to deal with cleaning those, and they have all sorts of automated robots that go around up and down the nets almost constantly to clean those nets from off the epifauna. Then you have vaccines. There are about 90 different species of bacteria in the gut of the salmon, but all of them need a particular gene in order to exist in that environment. So this gene has been identified, and there has been a vaccine aid that will shut down that gene or keep it from being expressed. And this is really effective. This is pretty impressive numbers. 90 to 95% reduction in over 2,000 fish. It only costs 10 to 20 cents per fish. But the one that I like the most, and this is something that's been used more and more in Norway, it's just starting to be used in other places, it's a very Star Wars thing. You have a central deal that emits laser rays. And those laser rays will identify with AI lice from the salmon and pick those lice off those salmon, about 3 to 5 lice per second. Now think about that, all over the place. 150,000 to 200,000 shots per laser per day. That's going to do a really good job on delicing all the fish in your pen. And as I said, this is becoming more and more useful in Norway. Of course, additional laser research is going to make it even more accurate. And I see this as a way of really effectively eliminate lice. Okay, the second main problem are escapees. You've got Atlantic salmon. They're going to escape. They can hybridize with any local fish. Of course, Atlantic salmon hybridizing with wild salmon in the North Atlantic is the same species, but they're different adaptations relative to the wild and the farm salmon. Farm salmon are bred to eat. They don't have any predators to worry about. So you may be breeding them to be more timid. And if they get out into the wild, they become easy prey for other things. Also, if they get out into the wild, they're going to have viruses and bacteria that will be spread out to the wild population. So even though it's the same species, this kind of hybridization between the wild and the farm salmon is not terrible. And as it shows up there, 71% of the genetic of the wild salmon in Norwegian rivers are infiltrated by farm salmon genomes. Escapees in Iceland, 2021, 81,000, 2023, 3,500. And while they don't seem to be really big numbers, but we do know that the Icelandic escapees will swim over to Norway and will also breed with those wild salmon in Icelandic waters. So again, the escapees are a problem in introducing disease or introducing pacifying genes into the wild salmon, make the wild salmon less aggressive and more susceptible to predation. Storms. You can see what a storm is going to do to cages. That's how they get out. A lot of them do. In Scotland, it's 75,000 escapees. And if you look at the returning salmon population, it's about 300,000. That's 75,000 or 25% of the return. If even 1% of those gets back, it's going to have a lot of hybridization. And farmed and wild hybrids are widely found in Scotland. And the Faroes, again, you can see the numbers decreasing somewhat, but the Faroese population is interesting because there are no rivers in the Faroes. So there never has been a wild population of Atlantic salmon. So there's no possibility of hybridization between the farmed and the wild salmon. However, the farmed salmon in Iceland and the Faroes do migrate over to Norway, and they have another slug of fed salmon that can potentially hybridize with the wild populations in Norway. And in Tasmania, a vicious storm, 30,000 escapees. Tasmania, of course, is Australia, and there's a huge debate down there between those for and those against open pen salmon farming, precisely because of this event. Escapees, introduced species, viruses, pancreas disease, infectious salmon anemia, Piscine retrovirus. By the end of the 18-month period that these salmon are in the pens, they are generally harvested at a weight of about 6 kilos. And after 18 months, then by virtually all fish will be infected by PRV. And it's also in the wild salmon. Now, was that natural? Did that get introduced by the escapee farm salmon? We don't know the answer to that, but nevertheless, it is in the wild salmon. Norway has a really good transparency as a country, not only in politics, but also in salmon farming. On a weekly basis, you can log onto this website and you can get a weekly report of all the salmon farms along the Norwegian coast. And it'll tell you those that are under the lice requirement and those that are over, identify them by color. And it also tells you where you find the various diseases of salmon all along the country. You need to log into this and find out. This kind of transparency does not exist in any other place that has farmed salmon. So a third problem is the fish food. Very expensive to feed these fish. $8 per kilogram of food is a major expense in farming fish. They have improved this quite a bit by having all sorts of sensors where they can judge the amount of food that should be delivered for the size of salmon in that pen. Obviously, as those salmon get bigger, they'll add more food to the system. But it's not a case of just throwing stuff out. It's a case of, here on salmon, this is what they need to grow. This is how much we're going to give them this week. We'll increase it next week and so on and so forth. So it's become a real science in terms of how much to feed. And again, one farm, and there's hundreds of farms and thousands of farms in Norway. One farm can have anywhere from 8 to 10 pens, and they may hold anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 fish. So we're talking about major, major numbers here. Fish food, what do you put in it? Well, you have a blended dry, 60 to 70% plant material, and it has to be marine. Although you can't get by with some terrestrial plants, but the marine is most important. Protein, plant proteins, soy and that sort of thing, marine proteins from fish meal. This comes from the small pelagic, and unfortunately are usually taken from third world countries in their coastal area. Those people need these small pelagic for food. They're being harvested, ground up to feed salmon that feeds the, if I can call them first world countries. So it's robbing people that need it to feed fish that people really don't need. Fats, vegetable oils, marine oils, omega-3. And this is a huge, huge discussion right now with respect to the source of omega-3 for farm salmon. Right now, most of it is coming from krill from Antarctica. They're taking enormous amounts from Antarctica, and by doing so, they are taking krill away from 4 species of whales, 3 species of seals, 3 species of seals, 3 or 4 species of penguins. Basically, they're taking food away from all the that evolved to live in Antarctica. Go on and on and on about the krill fishery down there. But so far, they get in there and take as much krill as possible, send it off to Montevideo, and then gets sent out to all the vendors that want this for the farm. And then the rest of it is sent up to Houston, of all places, where it's processed into oils that are used for health foods, for feeding your pet hermit crabs, and for other things that are somewhat superfluous. Carbohydrates, maize, and then, of course, the micro. And so it's a very complicated chemical. It's better now than it was in the past. They reduce the amount of small pelagic that they need. And the whole question of omega-3, omega-3 comes from the krill. Where do the krill get their omega-3? What do krill eat? Phytoplankton. So can we harvest, can we produce vast amounts of phytoplankton on land to provide the omega-3 for the krill? A no-brainer, right? Well, we know I wouldn't do the amount of phytoplankton for the whole biofuel program. So there are at least 2 concerns out there that are trying to raise enough phytoplankton to get the omega-3 for the krill industry. And there are several challenging grants that have been awarded to various companies to provide $100,000 to the winner who comes up with a really good technique for making that transfer from phytoplankton directly to the salmon. Okay, the omega-3 can come from the fish, grinding up the pelagic and the krill. It's got to be used responsibly. You can't be taking more and more krill out of Antarctica and taking from the mouths of all those organisms that need it. Antibiotics. Virtually all countries have strict regulation regarding antibiotics, and many of them don't use it at all at any point in the life cycle of the salmon. For example, the Faroes, Iceland, Norway, no antibiotic. Canada has drastically reduced the antibiotics. Scotland, 10% of the farm. And I keep mentioning Chile. Remember, Chilean salmon is 51% of all the salmon we eat in the U.S. Exceptionally high use, 351 tons of antibiotics used in the salmon, in farm salmon in Chile. They're planning to reduce it, but they have an extremely poor track record in not only maintaining their farms and the netting, but in several other things as well. And this is at least half of salmon that we eat in Europe. Vaccines against diseases and viral and bacteria. You can improve the welfare by using this and inject it with smokes in the size of about 50 to 100 grams before they're putting into the seawater. They're anesthetized and they can do 18 to 35,000 fish per hour. Now, how do they do this? So it's highly automated, anesthetize the fish with this automated system, position it, and here comes a needle, bag, vaccinated, go off, do this again and again and again. Let's get speeded up in a couple of seconds. And you can see that they don't waste a whole lot of time vaccinating these fish. That vaccine is crucial for reducing, if not eliminating, many of the diseases that would normally be affecting these fish. Fifth problem, waste accumulation under the pens. The waste that the fish produce, the excess food that drops down to the bottom, obviously collects on the bottom, and it's going to lead to a buildup of sediments, high nutrients, which will lead to algal blooms. Algal blooms are going to cut down the O2, create an anoxic situation, stress the fish, kill the fish, and it's a whole thing that you don't want to have. The extent of this depends upon the farm, the amount of water flow, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what it looks like in a normal situation under the pen. Remember, it's out over the open sea, depth of about 30 meters, 100 feet or so over a flat bottom, sort of a soft substrate bottom. And below a fish pen, you have sort of a gauze all over the bottom. And anoxic in many cases. So you don't want this. You want to keep a reference weight. How do you do that? Well, you take a technique from farming. You allow that area under the pen to lie fallow for a certain amount of time. During that fallowing period, the accumulated waste and accumulated food be swept away by the prevailing currents. And when that happens, then you can start it over again. So example of Norway had from 2 months to 1 year of allowing that area under the pens to be undergoing fallow. Scotland, a minute, 1 month, often longer, and you can read the rest of it. Now, if you have 8 to 10 pens, that does not mean that all those pens are at the same stage of development. You might have one pen ready for harvest. You might have another pen that just received the smoke. So the fallowing, after you've harvested, may not reach those pens that have just started. And that's a crucial problem here. So fallowing is a great idea, but there's some subtleties here that may not be working out as much as you would like it to. Okay, you also get waste accumulation in the hatcheries. Remember, you're raising zillions of fish from the egg stage in the hatchery. Those fish do the same thing as the adults. They're producing waste from the excess food, from their body waste. All that gets flushed out into the nearest field. And it's just another introducing sewage into the system. And when that happens, again, you have reduction of the O2. You have a situation very similar to what experienced in LA when they had one sewage system for the whole city of LA discharging into 30 feet of water, and you had about a foot of sludge, which was anything and everything except sea urchins, as you can see here. Why were sea urchins able to do that? Because they could absorb nutrients through their skin. They couldn't reproduce with that limited amount of food. They couldn't grow, but they could stay alive until things change. So the hatcheries are doing the same thing as what happened in LA with humans. And you can see here, the nitrates and phosphates, raw sewage from 17 to 20 million people. That's 3 times the population of Norway, just from the waste coming from the hatcheries. And that hasn't been addressed yet. Then you have massive die-offs in the pens. You see the numbers up there, 63 million deaths in 2023. An average of 70% of all adult salmon produced in the farms died before they ever got to market. And here you can see a lot of dead fish floating up the surface. Scotland, 17 million dead before harvest. Again, dead fish floating in the pens. Severe gill damage and other damages to them. Chile, we keep picking on Chile, but they deserve it. And I'm not apologizing to anybody of Chilean ancestry here, but that's the way it is. 23 to 24 million salmon died in Chile's farm, with over 1.5 million in one farm alone. Not only are the fish in danger, but the workers. 90 workers have died in accidents related to the hatcheries, the fishery farms in Chile. We have an OSHA requirement down there. And opposed to that, we had 1 death in that same period. So another problem with the Chilean farms, if they have a farm, or however much time it takes for them to grow up with salmon for harvest, and then they just take up and leave everything there. They just hopscotch all through the fjord system down there and leave paths of destruction the whole way. So we don't have a whole lot of empathy or concern about damaging the environment. Why are they doing this? Why are we having these die-offs? Warmer sea. We blame that for a lot of problems we have. Definitely here, water gets warmer, increases the algal blooms, which decreases the O2, increases the jellies and the stinging shells, the stinging gills of the fish. The fish die because of that. The treatments and the lice itself are a problem. High density in the open pen, many reasons for the problems that we see with the fish die-offs in these pens. Okay, back to Norway. Fish farming started in the 60s, late 60s. It's sort of a mom pop type of thing. It started to take off to the extent that in the 1970s, there were many advancements, particularly in how to raise the smolt, how to get through that smoltification process from freshwater into the seawater, and also development of the dry feed, which back then was almost exclusively small fishes. Catch fish, grind them up, give them to another fish. Since then, there have been large-scale development in the 1980s. For example, in the early 1970s, they produced 500 tons. Last year, they produced 1.4 million tons of fish. And 97% of that is exported. That contributes over about 52% of the total farm salmon production for the world. So Norway's a big player. The future. As I said, right now it's 1.4 million tons. They want to double that in only 4 years. We're talking about 2.8 million tons. They want to bump that up to 5 times the current population in 2050. But they have some few problems because there are other concerns that want to use the coastal areas that these farms are put into. They have the right to see of the farms. The farms have to go in a specific area. That area has to be investigated for 3 years before they can put the farm down. A lot of red tape you have to go through. Have to be monitoring the oxygen level, temperature, current, all that sort of thing before they can even begin to put a farm in that area. Once they get through all of that, then they can put them in. But only in certain places. Those certain places have already been filled up with farms. So there's limited amount of room or site where the future fish farm can go. And of course, people want to have coastal homes. They don't want to have the farms in front of the bedroom window or the living room window. So there's this fight between those people that, like we do, keep the oil derricks out of our view. You want to keep the fish farms out of their view. So what Norway had done in this case is it instituted last year a 25% tax on all fish coming from the fish farms. That's a huge dent in the price. And what has led to a decrease in the number of applications for fish farms along the Norwegian coast, but they still have thousands of them. Iceland, they still have wild salmon, as does Norway. They are restricted to these rivers, as you can see here. And because of that, because they want to protect that wild salmon, they only allow the farms in 2 places, northwest coast and the far east. And they have a very strong regulation and risk management program in place, but they've also got something else happening, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. The light, as I mentioned, is mandatory in all open pen systems in Iceland, primarily to attract the zooplankton that they can graze, but also keep the fish from going into a reproductive cycle. So all they do is just eat, and they get to market size relatively fast, and they get pretty large and quite passive. They can just feed on whatever is given to them. Scotland. The main export of Scotland is, of course, whiskey. Salmon comes in close second. They had a problem to the escapees and with the deaths. 33% of the Scots want to stop fish farming in Scotland. 2024, 10 out of more than 200 farms lost 50% of their salmon. So they have a big problem with a massive loss. And in 2025, there's been concern among the general public about the waste accumulation, both from the salmon themselves and from the food that they not eaten. And they're worried about how that's going to affect the salmon, fish, wild fish, recreational fishing. Again, in Scotland, fly fishing, catch and release. The Faroes, mostly in this part of the Faroes, as you can see, they have growth sites and then they have smolt sites. Now, the Faroese salmon that I mentioned in that previous slide showed that they have super high premium. And what the Faroese do is different from what the other ones. Remember, farm 50 to 200,000 fish per pen, and they can have as many as 8 to 10 pens. That does not mean that they are all in the same stage of development. You can have some ready to be harvested, you can have some that just receive the smolt. Not so in the Faroe. is an all-in, all-out policy. All the pens will be at the same stage of development. So all of them will be harvested at the same time. All of them will undergo at least 6 months or so of fallowing before they can start again. And during that fallow period, everything is scrubbed down, a deep cleaning type of thing that has to be certified by the veterinary program in the Faroes. So they have minimized the lice problem. And as a result, the Faroese farm salmon are high quality and highly desired, but unfortunately only provide only 8% of the market to the U.S. So what this does is that really reduces the property that transferring disease from one pen to the other, and of course the lice. That brings us to Maine and Maritime Canada. Maine has 24 to 25 open pen farms along the outer coast and down east. All of them are owned by one company, Cook from Canada. In New Brunswick, almost all of them are owned by Cook from Canada. Cook has a bad name, particularly in Maine. Been cited several times for animal abuse citations. For that reason, it's not a preferred product because of the animal abuse and other things as well. So even though it's right next door, it's not a real big market to the U.S. Consumption. British Columbia is also owned by the Cook Company. I should mention the one fish farm in Washington State was owned by Cook. They had a storm and wiped everything out. 900,000 salmon were released. And then that led to the abandonment or the abolishment of all open pen fish farms in Washington. There's still no open pen farms in the state of Washington. They still own a few in Canada, British Columbia. And the situation in British Columbia is different. First of all, they don't harvest Atlantic salmon. They harvest pinks and chum primarily. And the federal government in Canada, when farming started, just simply moved all these farms into tribal waters without asking for permission. That also set up a debate because some of the tribes wanted the money, others didn't want the Fed to tell them what to do. So this back and forth finally led to an abolishment of all fish farms, open pen farms in British Columbia in 2029. A decision that is highly regarded by the tribal groups in British Columbia. I'm getting off on the sidetrack here, but it's showing the rather lack of responsibility by the Cook farming and the Cook family in both West and East Coast Canada. The Cook problems increasing, all these sorts of problems, and that's the destruction of the pen in Washington State, which led to the demise of the open pen in Washington. Okay, alternatives. There always has to be an alternative, and this one is the RAS. We recirculated aquaculture system. And here, the entire life cycle is on land, from fertilization to production of the fish that would then be led to slaughter. Everything is on land. This will eliminate sea lice, eliminates escapees, eliminates waste discharge because it's all filtered, eliminates leaching by antibiotics if it's used, but it's still a problem with food competition. You got to feed these guys just as you do in the wild. And until you come up with better solutions for the food, particularly as another source for omega-3, you're still going to have the problems of impacting other ecosystems by feeding something to the farm family. So how does this work? Well, one part of the massive area is going to be devoted to the egg hatchery. You hatch them, and then they go into juvenile tank, the fry stage, and then they go into the smoke tank, and they go right into the production tank, all salt water. The discharge from that, it's filtered through biofilters before it goes back onto the ocean. And then you finally take them in trucks, load them on the trucks through here, and then it's dispersed for market. Really nice system. However, it's quite expensive because you got all these pumps you got to worry about. So if you look at the expenses, there's the total production cost. An open pen is about $5 per kilogram. An RAS is about $6. Capital expenditure, lower initial setup in the open pen, but a higher license cost. Extremely high initial. You got to build the whole process. That can be really high. Primary cost drivers are feed, sea lice treatments, mortality. Finally, cost drivers in the RES system are energy, oxygen, have to add the oxygen, and the capital investment depreciation. Energy is a big one. Biological yield time, 14 to 22 months in seed, probably 15. Open ends give about a 24% profit margin. RES is about 18%. Primarily because of the excessive use of energy for pumps and lights and everything else. Carbon footprint. Production only, about twice as high for RES than it is for open pen. Transportation to the consumer, orders of magnitude higher in the open pen because all those fish are frozen and sent, or frozen and or fresh using airplanes, which is a huge carbon footprint. And the total carbon footprint, as you can see, is about half for the RES system. And you can see the trends here. RES is increasing, projected in 2026 to 2030. That's going to get larger and larger as this gets smaller and smaller. That brings me to Iceland. Iceland has pretty good open pen system, but they're highly restricted in where they can be placed. And there's a lot of debate in Iceland for or against the production of open systems. What Iceland is doing is taking advantage of the almost unlimited amount of power that they have, that they don't need diesel fuel for. For example, this massive RES system developed in the southern Iceland, energy source of geothermal and hydroelectric, drops the cost down considerably, increases the profit margin. That's not enough. They have another one going pretty close to it, also geothermal and hydroelectric. And out on the Heme, which is a city in the Vestmannaeyjar Island, out here, they're just constructing one that's going to be looking like this, geothermal and hydroelectric. No carbon source of energy at all. It's essentially free. So this is really going to reduce the cost of the RES system. You can see that these three RES systems, that is what you're going to call them, will be the death for the open pen system in Iceland. And Iceland will enter into the global market as one of the leaders in inexpensive farm fish. It eliminates all of the problems except for the food, which will be a huge success in terms of the ecosystem effects of farm fish. So the decision you need to make is, if you eat salmon, are you going to restrict yourself to wild, given the fact that it's way more expensive? Or if you were going to restrict yourself to farm, if you go to farm, where is your source? How are they produced? What is their environmental footprint or their sustainability? Or maybe you can do both of these. Have your farm salmon, 3 times a month, and then splurge for the wild salmon 2 or 3 times a year. But the choice is yours, and don't ask me what I prefer, because I don't eat fish. Okay, any questions?
Thank you very much, Jim. So yeah, we've been presented with a little bit of a conundrum for those of us that like to eat fish. Who has a question?
Thank you so much for that incredible talk. You were talking a little bit about ranching, about sort of raising them and then setting them loose and having them come back. When you're talking about escapees from farm fish, a lot of that was like the genetic diversity and the like change from like farmed genetics versus wild. Do you know if ranched fish are also like have more of a wild? Is there issues with them interbreeding with wild populations? And like, are there any cons towards ranching? Thank you.
Good questions. First of all, you need a brood stock for ranching and or open pen. Brood stock always comes from within. They don't catch wild fish and use that as brood. So one batch can be a brood stock for the next batch. The next part of your question was, is there any advantage to that? That's problems with weight accumulation because you're not holding the fish for as long. Uh, that's about the only reason. And the fact that you can have less escapees because you don't have the open pens that can be destroyed by environmental concerns or whatever. So I think those are the big reasons why you do the ranching. People don't want to have open pens. They've never been allowed in Alaska for whatever reason. I mean, Alaska's got so much wild fish, you really don't need that. And the fish that are produced in the ranching farms in Alaska are native to Pacific Northwest. Usually the pinks are the chums because they have a shorter period of time in the sea, only 1.5 years. You can get them out and back much faster than a king, for example. That can have to be at sea for up to 4 years. But it's economically feasible to do it in a short time than it is in the long-term type. No Atlantic salmon, you don't have to worry about hybridization, but you do have to worry about the fact that the ranch salmon have been selected for by generation and generation of brooding salmon that can be introduced in some character in the wild salmon that they do interbreed, and they do. And the ramifications of that are really unknown.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Jim. Great talk. Sorts of stuff I just learned. I have 2 questions actually. The astaxanthin that you mentioned, that give astaxanthin, yeah,
That's exactly.
that gives the salmon their color, comes from phytoplankton, although you said it comes from krill also. Does that include the omega-3s, or is that just a coloration?
Just the coloration, and it doesn't come from phytoplankton because the salmon do not eat phytoplankton. They feed on things that feed on phytoplankton.
Okay.
The phytoplankton provide the pigment for the fill, which is salmon feed on.
Right. Okay.
And actually, to follow up on that, the paper out that shows quite definitively that this may be a myth. They may not need omega-3.
They may not what?
The fish, they may not need omega-3, which case you would cut the krill out completely. Obviously, that doesn't need to be replicated by an independent lab to see if that's the case. But that paper showed that you could get just as much omega-3 from a ball thing chicken waste.
Wow.
So, and your second question?
Second question is, as a consumer, because I do eat fish and I love salmon, but I go to my local fish market and I'll say, do you know where the salmon is from? And most of the time they don't. They can tell you what country it's from, but that's it. So how do we go about finding?
The first thing you can do is to ask the place where you buy it. Who is your fish supplier?
Who is?
Yeah, I mean,
Oh.
where do they get it from?
Yeah, okay.
And they should tell you. Now, whether you can believe them or not, that's another issue. But a lot of the salmon that I see, I used to work at Hannaford in Portsmouth, and we had one of those supermarket sushi places. And when the salmon came in, I'd always take a look at it, and all of those had labeled salmon from Chile.
Okay.
Now, if you go to a high-end Japanese market, I'm sure you're not getting Chilean salmon. They're probably getting it from the Pacific Northwest, fresh or fresh frozen. But the least expensive supermarkets for sushi, or least expensive sushi restaurant and or supermarket are undoubtedly getting it from Chile.
Good to know. Thank you.
Hi. One question is with the RAS farming, are they recoup the fertilized water? Has anyone set up a system for growing sort of plants, whether it's salads or strawberries or part of an aquaponic system? And if is that feasible? And are the nutrients from the waste of the salmon production good nutrients for growing plant-based?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but it makes sense that if you filter stuff out, you're going to have to get rid of that filtrate. And if it's going to be high in nitrates and phosphates and things that fertilizer is made of, I would think that if you're a good business person, you're going to look for some way to sell that and get more profit. So I would hope that that's what they're doing with it, as opposed to burying it somewhere on land. I'll check into that, see what happens.
What would you say are the ideal environmental conditions for salmon aquaculture?
Zero condition, you want a zero tolerance for everything?
But no, like what is the best regions from a climatological perspective to create a salmon farm? What waters are best for salmon farming?
Um, you need cold water, you need fast water, you need high oxygenated water. All of those parameters need to be measured, as I said, for 3 years before you can have a site for salmon production in Norway. Other countries in the North Atlantic, the Faroes, Iceland, have that naturally. Cold, deep, fast flowing, high oxygen. That's the best situation. And that, of course, is changing with environmental conditions.
But where exactly is the salmon farming done in Chile then?
Where,
Like which part is salmon farming done in?
uh,
Part of Chile is salmon farming.
Chile is all through the Patagonia area in the Strait of Magellan.
I see.
They put them in really shallow water, which increases the problems. Of course, rips out the kelp, does all sorts of things like that. And then they abandon them. The infrastructure stays there. They do all that damage to the environment. They don't really care about that. They're trying to improve that because they know they have a bad reputation. It's like it takes quite a bit of time for that to be fully implemented. There is a strong anti-farming component in Chile.
We have time for one more question.
I just want to say thank you so much for coming and giving this talk for us. I kind of have a two-part question. I don't really know. So first part of my question was, has the overfishing of the wild salmon gone down since the aquaculture has increased?
The wild population of salmon, I think it remained pretty much stable. It may be increasing in some areas, for example, in Norway, because they're regulating recreational fishing, but also no country by law can commercially harvest wild salmon. So that may give the salmon a respite from the wild salmon, temporary security, and you may see increasing. However, when you remove all the salmon, you allow competing species to come in. So even though you set the stage for salmon to return, there may not be room at the end for them to go into.
Great. And then my second part is kind of asking your opinion. Like would in terms of carbon footprint, would consuming more wild salmon than the farm salmon at this point, like, do you think that it should maybe like deter us from consuming the farm salmon if price wasn't an issue?
Price is always going to be an issue.
I know.
Um, I don't know how to answer that.
Great. Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, Jim, thank you so much. I learned tonight that after, was it 44 years, this is actually the first rock talk you've given. So it seems very appropriate that you'd help us wrap up the year 2026 season on the 13th one of the year. That's good luck, probably, right? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Jim, thank you so much for being here. Thanks, folks online as well. Good night.